and welcome to the Beginner's Handbook. I'm Jordan.
I'm Jamie.
And in this episode we are going to talk about heavy role-playing games, or a lot of role-play in a game, and how you might handle that as a GM.
Yeah, so as well as us talking about it, we'll give a quick sort of definition, I think, of what we would consider heavy or a lot of role-playing, or in-depth role-playing, whatever what you want to think about it, and then we'll kind of work our way backwards or forwards depending on how we talk about it, from kind of light to heavy.
Yeah, so I think then we'll just start with the usual stuff. The first question I have for this is maybe more around players, but how do you feel about heavy role-playing games? I know that I used to, whenever I heard people talking about D&D, I was like, that's too much for me. Then I would play Cthulhu, which was my gateway drug into role-playing games. But then I was like, okay, I would never do that. Then I've spoke to LARPers, like that's as heavy roleplay as you can get. But what do you think about role-playing, or heavy role-playing games, or in-depth role-playing in your games? Do you find them immersive? Do you find it maybe too difficult? Even now I find it kind of hard sometimes, like especially when you're running a game, you've got 6 or 7 characters, it can be kind of hard to get into all their headspaces and speak to 4 players at different times. So would love to just hear your opinion on that. But also, if you're a GM and you are into in-depth role-playing in your games, what tips do you have for people either listening or watching, or even for us to have? It's certainly an area of role-play that I do bits of it. Sometimes I do voices, sometimes I don't. I'm not very good at the voices, which is why I don't do them in the first place for the most part. But I know people that really do get into it, and even as in-depth as changing your lighting and all that. That's a fun one. But that's what we would like to ask you as the GM, if you've got any tips for anyone else.
Yeah, so that all being done, that all being said, let's move on to some form of kind of definition so that everybody knows what we're talking about when we're talking about heavy RP. And if anybody thinks that that's light out there, then well done. You're
probably
a
a LARPer.
player than me. Yeah, you probably are. Yeah,
nothing wrong with that. The way I said it, I wasn't getting at LARPers. Certainly there's a game that I've just got over that holiday period. As people know, Vampire the Masquerade, it turns out it's very self-aware when it comes to LARPing. Some of the stuff in the games, like if you want to be some form of cult leader, you could be a LARPer or something like that. I was going, that's really hardcore. But yeah, so I think then for me, the way I would define like heavy role-playing is when you're kind of asking, I would say the GM's part of this as well, but if players are often only really referring to people as their character names, or talking as a character, they tend to stay in the mind basically of their character, and the GM's probably talking to them directly as a character, maybe also talking to them via NPCs, all in character, even actually presenting NPCs in a way it's almost as if you're talking to that NPC in real life. To me, that's heavier role-playing games, because certainly there's ways for you to do the details at a much higher level, maybe make it more narrative than immersive. I talk about narrative a lot, but if you're immersed in that character and you're getting players at the table to be immersed in their characters, for me that's what constitutes heavy RP.
Yeah, so pretty much agree with everything Jordan said there, and I kind of very, very quick way of kind of analysing and figuring out what kind of game you're in. Is the GM talking to your character via another character, and are they spending a minimum amount of time giving you descriptions of places and asking you, the individual, what you want to do? So if it's very much character to character, and that's rather than player to player, that's GM to player, then it's probably pretty heavy and pretty RP focused.
Yeah, I mean, to give you an example, I might touch on this a bit later, but even from the case of like visiting a shopkeeper, there's games I've watched that's been almost unbearable, quite frankly, because it's like literally everything is like heavy role play. So you're speaking to the shopkeeper, the GM's narrating how he checks his stock and all that, and then referring back and asking for gold and bartering, which is fine generally, but there's a level that becomes a bit like too deep for me. But that's what I consider like heavy shop RP. But whereas I'll fluctuate a lot between heavy and light RP in my games, but a light way to do that would just go, what you're looking for, the shopkeeper has it, it's this amount of gold, and you can do that transaction in a fraction of the time, basically.
Yeah.
So that's like an example between like what we mean with the immersive RP versus something that's just more descriptive, maybe narrative.
Yeah, and again, like Jordan's saying, if it's something that's kind of in the middle, then the GM might give you RP moments like from one of the NPCs to one of your characters, but again, you're in a shop, you're looking for this, you're looking for that, right? Do a roll, do this, do that, whatever. There you go, right, done. And again, like going even further down the scale to where it's really, really light. It's the absolute bare minimum time that characters are talking to each other, and it's very much on what you want to do, and a lot of the RP is probably going to be with the players rather than directly backwards and forwards between everybody.
Yeah. So that's perfect, and that kind of leads us into, I think the first point that I want to talk about is how to structure a game in a way that can facilitate heavy RP. I think, by the way, the golden rule for me, I'll maybe touch this just before we finish to summarise, but I'm saying it now in case I forget, is to be flexible with it, because there's going to be times where heavy RP either is a bit sluggish, or it's just easier to just say it to somebody so they can get the gist. If a character's confused about a detail, you can just say, by the way, and instead of making them roleplay asking the question again and all that. Before I move on as well, one thing with heavy RP games I've noticed is combat can be quite narrative as well, and tends to be like describing kills and things like that. So that's just another wee example of a heavier RP.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah, and just touching on that as well, if any of your players are talking in character as they're fighting, probably heavy. And the RP side of things, I think most people will fall in, I was going to say the trap, but it depends on what kind of game you're trying to run, of going, right, do a roll, right, this, and then just describing what's happening rather than using the character's voice in the middle of combat, so to speak.
First time I realised I ran RP heavy combats was when the guys get a triple kill and they tore the big bad guy up, and they all were screaming their names and their kind of group name and stuff at like 4 a.m. And I was like, oh, I've just taken it to the next level, man. I didn't realise. But you'll probably find as well, some games will focus, or some GMs will focus, or groups will focus more on RP, heavier RP at different times, and certain things like travelling might not really be RP'd at all in some cases. I've mentioned my thoughts on travelling before. I think in the travelling episode, I think that's actually out so far. But we have covered that, so I won't go much more into that. No. Well, if we've not, it's coming, so I think we have. I remember talking about it, but I don't know if it's out yet, so we'll just see. So just keep your eye out for that one if you've not seen it, and hit the notification bell if you want to see it and it's not out yet, so just make sure to do that. Anyway, going back to how to structure your game in ways that can facilitate RP, I think for me, the first rule, it's the first thing to do, and we've talked about communicating 1,000 times before, but that's again like the first step to that, and it's make sure people are actually interested in doing a heavy RP game, and if they don't know what that means, say that to them. And if you get a sense that maybe they're not sure, or you're getting half yes, half no, then just fluctuate between the two, and you can roleplay heavily with certain people. As long as you're conscientious about people that don't want to do that, and you're not leaving them out of your game, then you can mix and be elastic between the two.
Yeah, and the thing is as well, like, obviously it depends on what's your individual situation is, but like we've said in previous episodes, like Jordan's just said there, talking is probably going to solve whatever issues you're having, and I don't think we'll ever be able to drive that point home enough unless we get t-shirts printed up or something, or
head tattoos,
or that. Remember, we need to get it in reverse though, so that we can see it as well, to remind everybody.
In the lens.
But if you are wanting to create a game, or you're already running a game and you want more RP in it, again, talk to everybody, figure out where they're at, and figure out if it's something that they want to do. Flip side, if you're playing a game and you've got a DM or GM or whatever, and you want them to be giving you a little bit more role play so that you can indulge in that yourself, then talk to them about it as well. You know, it's going to work both ways. So depending on what your situation is, it's still a valid thing. Get talking about it and figure out what you want to do moving forward.
Yeah, it's not like the same severity, but the same way that you might approach players or a group of players about the content of a game, maybe it's something that could be triggering. Like, for example, I'm potentially going to be running, I'm going to shout the name out, it's a Grindhouse Ultimate Collection. It's a series of games on the Miskatonic repository for Call of Cthulhu. They're very much in the theme of Grindhouse horror films. These tend to be super violent, you know, and all of that stuff. So with players, I'm going to be giving them a wee trigger warning about it. But if you're working with a new group or you're running a game with a new group, it's worth just checking in a similar way, but obviously the severity ain't anywhere near as bad. But just checking with them, are people up for it? And if you're not sure what sort of game you're getting into as a player, you can just ask the GM, like, is this going to be RP heavy? Is it going to be a mix? Just whatever. And the reason it's so important to do that is because you want to make sure that nobody's going to feel awkward or embarrassed. I get loads of people, especially with one of my groups, people cycle out, almost like you get special guests that pop in and out because they might not play and are only just playing because they've heard it's fun, you know, so things like that happen too. So you want to make sure that people are kind of knowing what they're getting in for. I think is probably the main reason. There's certain groups I wouldn't want to heavy RP because I know that probably means about 4 hours of figuring out what direction you're going so in a night. But there's other players I love doing it, you know, so it's worth just checking it by people is really my main point with that.
Yeah, and again, that's a good enough point that again, you might be the person out there that's sitting offended behind you know, your screen there that's sitting going, but that's the best part about role playing. We get to take 4 hours to decide to go north. You know, yeah, okay, if that level of detail is something that you're into or your group's into, great. But I think for most people, when you start to break it down to that point, then it starts to lose what it's about, which is, you know, to kind of give you that little bit of escapism and stuff. But when you're actively having to plan travel as a character, talking to another person who's acting in character, who you're then relaying with the GM to try and find a solution for transport, and then it starts to slow and kind of grind down.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're a wee bit exaggerating when we speak about North, but I have been part of games, not ones that I've run, but certainly some I've played at the local comic shop, where that's something either I've experienced it or people I know that do a lot of role-playing games have experienced cases where some groups want super granular info. Like if they're travelling north, for example, they want to know the roads, they want to know the branching off paths, they want to know it all. Whereas like if I run Curse of Strahd, I think there's a map out there that tells you the time it takes between each location, and in Strahd, just in case you don't know, you're supposed to roll every whatever it is, 30 minutes or something, that they're on the road for a random encounter. I don't tend to do that because players want to get to point A from point A to B, but others would want to go through that level of detail. So it's worth just figuring it out even from that perspective. It sets you up or sets your expectations as a GM about what sort of game that you'll need to bring to the table. But it also means that other players, if they're not into that, then you can basically save their pain from actually needing to push them through all of that. So I think then in terms of also setting up your structuring a game in a way that helps facilitate heavier RP, we've actually probably touched some of the stuff already. Just a couple of the ones that jump to me right now is like addressing people in their character's name, for example. What does Cromir do in this moment, Jordan? And I'd be like, well, I rage, I get angry, and then do my thing. So stuff like that, it's a kind of simple way to do it. Just because people will start to talk in the first person if they're doing it, or if they're immersed enough, they'll do it in the first person.
Yeah. And I think, although that might seem obvious, and although it might seem really simple, I think it's so easy, especially if it's a group that you've known for a long time or you're particularly close with, to just go by default and use their name rather than the character's name, because like for us, we've known each other for years, that it can sometimes be hard to click into the character because you're so used to spending time with each other that you have to physically bully yourself and force yourself into doing that. But if you do that enough, then the longer the night goes on, the easier it becomes, and then the kind of more natural the kind of RP elements become, I think.
Yeah, totally. Even from that combat perspective there, like I do this depending on how late the combat is going on, but when we were playing these dwarf characters, you know, I would describe getting angry and running in and taking slices. Now, very experienced players who want to do deep roleplay probably won't say, I'm going to rage. Now, they might, for the GM's perspective, but... benefit. Sorry, GM's benefit. But they might just describe what they're doing, you know, and then people know what they're doing, you know. So I've seen games where almost there's zero jargon, but that's a whole different thing. That's a whole level of both knowledge and commitment in a game, I think.
Yeah, and again, if something like that's happening, then you need either a switched on GM to read between the lines, or a GM that trusts the players to know their abilities and, you know, all that sort of stuff in the detail. Or if you've got a GM that's a bit unsure, rather than going and breaking the rhythm of that. So again, like if it's a barbarian and they're raging and they're sat at a table and an argument's happening and they're about to initiate combat, that rather than, like Jordan saying, going, I am going to rage, and making it as obvious as that and blurting out that statement, that what they do is when they're talking, they talk about throwing the table over and then start whatever the bit of combat is. So they're actually, you know, they're physically describing something that is, you know, causing anger and blah, 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 blah. Yep. And again, if there's GMs there and they're a bit unsure whether they have triggered that or if they haven't triggered it, and just, you know, a sentence for clarification, then you'll get a yes or a no, and then just carry on with everything as is. Yeah,
probably the most common version of like heavier roleplaying I've seen saying is, I mean, the basic version of raging would just say, I'm going to rage, and that's it. Whereas a heavier roleplay version would describe themselves getting raging, and then just say, oh, I'm using rage, and you know, they'll do that. So they'll favour the narrative over the technical, whereas very light role. I've seen games that's like, I'm going to do my 2 attacks. With Great Weapon Master, I've done this 1,000 times. Great Weapon Master, Reckless Attack, do this, and we're just, because there's so much stuff we're doing in combat. That's not very heavy RP, but it's just something for the expediency that we do that. Whereas somebody might actually describe all that first and then put the footnote almost to see what they've done. And that's something that if you are running a heavier RP game, you can start to encourage that way of thinking, that if an NPC's giving you something, or maybe they bump into you somehow, the GM might describe them going into their bag and, you know, opening up the buckles they see inside. There's various things in here. They pull out a bag of kind of hefty looking things that jingle. It's a pack of It's a pack of gold coins, and they give it to you. You know, so that's a heavier RP version. It's hard to do it on the fly. That's a heavier RP version of just saying the guy gives you 100 gold. You know, so that's the kind of difference. But if you want to facilitate that heavier RP, it's always better just to think of it like you're trying to describe the scene to your players, basically, and you'll probably fall into the heavier RP moments when you describe these things. Yeah, anything else?
No, pretty much.
Okay, cool. So I think the other thing to do then is, I'm trying to think, so you can, one way to try and encourage it, because people, if they're new to it or they're not comfortable with it, is they'll probably not fall into their character's first person. You know, they won't be in their character, so to speak. So one way to do that is encourage players by calling them out by their name, like I've done that during Alien. What's your name? John Wilson, what are you doing? Corporate agent. So, you know, calling things like that, and people start to go, well, I'm going to do this, because you know, even just relabeling your players at the table, it starts to make them go, oh, they start to refer. So I guess it's a Pavlov's dog type thing. You know, people start responding to their names.
Yeah, just you've said that, just popped into my head there. One of the platforms that we use if we're not in person, and sometimes when we're in person as well, because it's good for maps and things rather than tables getting cluttered. There's Roll20. On Roll20, if nobody knows this, you can change your display name at the bottom on the game. What we normally do is change it to the character names, and again, helps RP, because rather than try to remember what the character is, going back to what we were saying, that if you know somebody really well, the impulse is to use their name. You've got the character name sitting right underneath their face, and it's easier to kind of click into that. But
yeah, no, you can even do that in things like Zoom. We're doing that right now for the Delta Green game that we're doing. So it's just a handy way, even just to remember names, because you know what it's like. I've had games of 9 players, and I'm going, I know half of these character names, and I still, in the moment, I just can't find it because I'm in the middle of combat or whatever it is. But that's just a nice, simple way to encourage a bit of role play, especially when people start referring like to I versus, you know, Cromir does this, you know. So I think as well then, that's probably the main things. But one thing I would also say, the last thing to encourage role play, especially if somebody gets into it and they're wanting a heavier role play game, is to reward people for doing good roleplay. And some of the stuff I think should normally grant a good wee inspiration or something as a challenging conversation, or a kind of, let's say a player's doing some persuasive techniques on a kind of hostile player, you know, having that roleplay conversation act out. Let's say that you as a GM and your player engaged, or players are engaged in it, and they do a great job. They bring up good points, they stay in character, they just nail it as a group. Definitely reward it, because it will encourage people to do it. What I would say though is, if you're going to do that, make sure that if there's someone there that isn't maybe heavy role playing, but they're part of the scene, maybe, you know, for whatever reason, maybe they're not comfortable with it, I would still reward them too with it, because if you don't do that, then you're going to start to exclude people. There's games I've been part of where if you don't read the GM's lore sheets that he'll send out, it's like you don't get inspiration, and it's just a weird. I get that the guy wants to have an immersive world, but what that means is anybody that's either too busy, and I get if they can't be bothered, then why you're rewarding them, but there's a lot of cases where people are just too busy for that. They're not there to negotiate the terms of their gods with the GM, you know, whereas but people that are too busy get penalised in that case. So try and make sure you're not doing that at your table if you're rewarding heavy RP.
Yeah, and basically that's the thing. There's the danger that you can end up, the danger that a reward ends up being perceived at the very least as like being left out or being excluded, or you know, whatever. So it's it's a good idea, and if you do it right, it's going to work well. But again, the main thing is that if you've got all your players, they're all of a similar level of kind of confidence to each other. You know, they're all, you know, none of them are more introverted than any other one. And if they're all up for doing role play at the same sort of level, then when you start giving out that reward, then everybody else is then going to go, right, well, they managed to get something there, so if I up that a little bit, I might get something. And gradually they'll all encourage each other to do a little bit more, as well as that reward being there. But if you've got somebody who's, I don't know, if you've got somebody who's a public speaker there at your group, and then you've got somebody who's, you know, a quiet librarian or whatever, no offence to any librarians out there that are watching or listening, but if you've got that kind of difference in how outgoing they are, then the danger is that the person who is more confident keeps doing more and more and more and more, and the person who's quiet and shy is doing less and less and less and less.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because there's times where, like, even as a player, you could encourage other players to speak in role play. Like if let's say there's a shyer person, that's a good point with shyer people. We'll maybe come on to them soon, but it's really for, like, you're playing the game together. That's the point. So if another player's encouraged, as well as the GM's rewarding people for RP, and then other players are asking maybe less roleplay people less into roleplay, and encouraging that, it's a way to just boost a bit of confidence, you know. Now that means like what to do is don't penalise people for not doing it. If they don't do a voice, don't take the rip out of them for not doing a voice. Don't take the rip out of them because they're not like super engaged in role play. People listening might think that doesn't happen. I've actually seen it happen, and it's really weird to me that people do that because you're there to play a game at the end of the day. So just don't take the rip out of people either, because that's one way that you'll totally ruin even somebody that's comfortable doing it. You could totally ruin their confidence, especially with that group in terms of heavier role playing. So that's just something that's worth saying, especially with that case where somebody might be less outgoing. They don't need to do it. You just push or you encourage it to a point, but don't drag it out. If somebody's like, well, if you say to them, if let's say a shyer person, like you ask them what do you want to do, and they say, oh, I'm going to go over there and open the door, or they just say something that's maybe not super role play, or maybe they say, oh, I ask the guy for passage through the door. Let's say a guard's at the door and he's saying he can't get in. So well, I want to ask him if we can get in because we're supposed to be there. You can say, well, how does your character word that? And they might try to word it. And if they do, then you're encouraging roleplay. But if they don't, they say, well, I'm not sure what to say. Well, don't push. Just let them get the point across. And then you can either kind of summarise what they might have said in character, or you just continue with the guard. Don't keep pushing people like that because they're there to have fun. And for the most part, it might not even be they're too shy to roleplay. They just might not like it. They might enjoy watching it, but they don't like doing it. I've certainly like that with voices. I'm not good at them. I sort of don't tend to do them anymore. Or I'm starting to do them more, but in the past, sorry, I didn't tend to do them because I'm not good at them. Can't hold an accent. Then I get taken the rip out off of our pals that we normally play with because my accent goes like up and down. It changes from German to something. Well, I'm saying German. Who knows what it was supposed to be in the first instance. But anyway, so that's our last thing. So I think then that takes us on to recommendations for what you should have ready for PC. So let's say you're a GM and you're going to run an RP heavy game. What sort of stuff do you think that you should probably prep for them? Because I would say heavy roleplay games tend to have a wee bit more prep going on in terms of like the minutiae, the detail. Is there anything you can think of?
Yeah, so just descriptions, and then we'll look at different types of description in a little bit of detail and maybe give a wee pointer here or there. And again, before we go into that and before we talk about it, although you might go and talk about a character and you might talk about stats and figures and whatever you've got written down in the character sheet from that point of view, and again that's good enough for letting everybody else at the table kind of get a feel of what the character's going to be like. But remember, when we are talking about descriptions, we're talking about like the kind of appearance, we're talking about personality, we're talking about all the kind of, try to think of a word to use it, all the kind of, padding's the wrong word. That's the wrong word.
Say padding for now, like basically the narrative parts, the thing to paint the picture, I suppose.
Yeah. The thing that's given the character life, basically, rather than the thing that's mechanically getting you through encounters or whatever. So that's what we're meaning by description. So first thing, description of characters.
Yeah, that's a good point, because if you do a fight, like for example, I've had great moments where we're in an RP heavy game, and I've done this and it just cracks me up every time I do it. Sometimes players be like, what class are they? And it's like, well, they're...
How would you know?
Yeah, they're a wizard because they're holding a staff, whatever. Like a very light RP game, you might be fine just talking like that candid. It's almost talking mechanical versus narrative.
I'm still pretty bad for doing that.
I mean, you can't help it sometimes. You just want to know, what class is that? Because they're kicking my ass.
And I need any form of clue to try and survive.
Yeah. But I mean, I've had games where it's like you see this big guy walking through, he's like big swagger, huge muscles, a big two-handed weapon. he's going to rage, and you go, oh crap, because you've just been described this big monster, and you're going, this guy's a big dude. So rather than thinking mechanically, players are thinking, they're painting this picture, what the descriptions you're talking about of maybe the character's physical appearance, maybe personality, whatever that is.
Yep.
And then obviously mechanical talk will come in at some point. So when I hear rage, I loved it the first time I threw a barbarian at someone, because I think all my baddies I wouldn't name their stuff. But then when I would say rage, because I'm like, I want them to know. And they go, oh God, we've been fighting this guy and we've been doing half damage the whole time.
Yeah. Although that, do you remember when that got used against us? I can't 100% remember the scenario, but our usual kind of group that we both have, we turned up to, it was like a tavern, and there was somebody that was described as being huge and was described as this and that, and you went, oh my goodness, this is somebody that's a barbarian or a paladin or something. So that's the route that we all went down, and it was only kind of halfway through the fight that we all clicked and went, oh, he threw that at us as a trap. He's actually a wizard.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Turns around with a cup of tea and a tiny wand that hides in his massive fist, I remember that.
That's practically what it was.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, it's ways to make your games a bit more fun. The things I tend to favour more narrative versus jargon or mechanical language, just because it makes the game a bit more immersive by default. I think people tend to enjoy that more, even if they're not heavy role players. But like I said earlier, I tend to fluctuate between, if somebody's not a big role player or they're new, I don't try and make them say stuff in their character all the time. But if I know there's somebody that likes role play, I'll address them as their character and ask them what their character says and things like that. I find being elastic's probably the best one, but obviously for this case we're talking about full RP. Character descriptions is a good one.
Yeah, and again, physical appearance, colour of hair, height, build, all that sort of stuff.
The gear they've got on, it's worth just... The thing is, we've talked about over prepping and stuff. You also don't want to do that. So basically the way I tend to do it is, it's almost like flashcards. I've got a name, I've got a basic description, I've got basic kind of visible items, and it's like 10 words or something, a name. So let's make it 12 words for the name. So stuff like that, and having that readily available can be quite handy. Or use a random character generator. It's awesome for it. I do it all the time. Even my own characters, like the big dwarf I played for 2 years, random generated character. It was awesome, and he's now still my favourite character I've played, I think, bar one.
And still alive at the time of recording.
And that's right, at the time of recording, and still alive, and may he still be alive when this releases.
It's published.
Yeah, when this releases, he better still be alive, or it's getting taken down. So have that stuff available to have. And the thing is, you can also wing it, but it will take a bit of time just to get comfortable winging it. Most of my games now, there's a massive amount of winging it detail. I do tend to have something lined out for players, but environments I don't tend to as much. Like Alien, for example, way too many areas for me to remember. So I just would look at the title and I'd see what the key things that were in that room, and then I'd just make up the description for the rest of it, unless there was any key things that you should know. But again, if you're describing an area, that's another one that you should do. And any key things that players need to know, like broken locked door, locked door with a broken lock, meaning they can walk in or whatever. Having that stuff at the forefront for you as a GM is going to save you some time. Curse of Strahd's an example of that. Lots of places to go into. Lots of detail to actually tell players, but the only thing you really need to know is what can players get in here or face in here if there's a threat. So stuff like that is super important to have. I'm trying to think, is there anything else? Atmosphere, details about the atmosphere is important. The vibe, I tend to use like how you feel, so you get the feeling that, or it feels like this, and I'll describe the feeling, especially if people are already in the first person mode with their characters. Talking to them, getting hairs at the back of their neck when they hear creaks behind them. It gives them... Now, they might not sit there with hairs at the back of their neck, but they get the idea, they get the imagery. I know in Alien, we definitely did have a couple moments like that, especially when I did jump scares. Just screamed and lunged at one of the players, and it was awesome.
It was.
But it was awesome for me. I don't know about them, but for me it was awesome. But that's the sort of stuff... When you speak about, so we've talked about characters, so that's descriptions and things. We've talked about the areas, just general, what does it look like, the key things you need to know in an area. I would say atmosphere is super important as well.
Yeah, and again, touching on what Jordan's saying there, that if you're starting out and you're wanting to increase the RP, and again, this is going to be more kind of from a GM's point of view with area rather than players.
Sure.
But, you know, like going back to Jordan's example of the door, then starting off and mentioning there's a door there rather than, right, now you're here and now you're, you know, that you're kind of transporting the players instantly to wherever they've talked about, letting them know there's a door there, because the first thing that they're going to do is ask to open the door or check that it's locked. Then your next step up from that is describing the colour of the door, and then your next step up from that is describing what the door's made of, and then, you know, getting into more detail, so you can gradually kind of layer physical descriptions up the more you're comfortable with doing it. And again, the main thing is just from the DM's point of view, keep the story moving, keep things moving. If you're having to pause to think of a description, then it's not quite there and it's not clicking and it's not natural yet. So just kind of take it back a step or two and just keep working on it.
I would even say in the case of you forget a detail, just make it up. You'll be fine. You know, I've plenty of times like read, so let's say I've run Curse of Strahd and I miss a very important detail, like you stand on the ground and skeletons grab you and I go, oh crap, I forgot about that bit. And then you just go, well, guess what happens now, folks? And you just go back and do it. Certainly talking about layering, maybe there's a wee thing, an episode around narrative and stuff, but I'll talk about that later. But one thing that I do, like certainly if I'm describing a room, I don't tend to describe everything in the room. Even if there's a key item, I don't describe the colours and stuff. I tend to actually say, oh, there's a door, so it's in their head and they know about it. Once they inspect it, they start to get the new info. Mostly I do that, so one, it keeps my narrations as kind of efficient as possible, because players will have a lot on in their heads, but it also means that if people need stuff repeated, you can explain it. So, but that's it. The areas is important, you know, as well. I think pretty much everything's quite important to try and portray. I think even sounds is another good one. If you want to immerse players, you want to tell them how it sounds on top of how it feels. Like if that feeling is the atmosphere, then the sounds, I suppose that fits into atmosphere as well. But you know, anything like that you can almost, even feeling of the room, like is it cold? How does that the table feel? What does that body feel like if they're doing a medicine check on it? You know. It might be a dry, cold corpse that they're touching. That might suggest it's been sucked out of its life or something. So all of that stuff can really help just layer and layer your narrative points to players. And if they're in character, it can really help the RP experience.
Excuse me. But talking about, or going back to when you're talking about atmosphere, again, probably most people, when they're talking about atmosphere, will talk about how they feel in a room or, you know, a particular situation, and forget about sound. And the thing is, like, with all of our senses, you know, that's how we experience the world, whether it's sight, whether it's sound, whether it's the, you know, the feel of temperature, whether it is physical touch itself, and so on and so on and so on. So when you're talking about atmosphere, I think, don't forget sound. I think it's really easy to skip over it and to go, when you walk in the room, you feel a sense of dread. But that's kind of going back to just a bare mechanical black and white description, rather than giving it when you walk in the room, it's completely silent. When you walk on the floor, your feet don't make any sounds of footsteps, and you get an overwhelming feeling of dread. You know, and having that is the very last thing that you drop in the end, but you've used all the descriptions to lead and point towards that.
That actually gives me just an example of describing a room. I played a Mork board game, which is done by, I think it's released by Free League, but I think it's Stockholm Cartel or something. Anyway, it's awesome. You should check it out. And it was the game that's inside the back of that book, just a one shot. and it was one of the areas of that kind of dungeon crawl was in a room full of chains, so I would describe that stuff as they were coming in, the kind of dripping of the water, the cold wind that comes through, it seems to be tunneling through somewhere, but eventually there was a event that happened in it, so I mean they were bumping into the chains. I had, they could hear it and they could feel the wet kind of mouldy chains banging off them, but then this event happened and everything went completely silent, like there was no sound in the whole room, and the players were like, what the hell is going on? Like, what is happening right now? And they're like, we're going to get attacked. It turns out there's just some stupid event that you roll on a table, and if you get it, it just makes the room silent until they leave. Like, that's all it was. But they were freaking out for the next 20 minutes because they're going, we're being chased by a ghost. I don't know why they thought it was a ghost or whatever it was they said. It was something that didn't make sense, but I suppose a room going completely silent doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense either, yeah.
But it encourages...
Yeah.
No, that heavy RP, it got them in a place where they were uneasy in every room after that, and it worked for the horror theme of the game. So
yeah,
pretty awesome. So
yeah, and again with that, like subverting expectations. You expect sound when you walk in, and then no sound, and then panic.
Yeah. I would say the last thing then is just. We mentioned NPCs, but just have a wee bank of them in case you want to, in case players do anything else or try and speak to anyone, because you can't prep for it all. You don't need to have notable NPCs all the time. Just have a bog standard NPC that sits there. As much as I hate needing to buy different books and all that, I prefer just having a book that has everything in it, like one core rule book that's like this thick, like 4 inches thick for people that are listening. But even the DM's guide. All you need. Yeah, that is all you need. Size does matter in this case. So the DM's guide has a whole bunch. I'm sure there's tables in the DM's guide, the Dungeon Master's Guide for D&D. There's an expansion for Pathfinder, for example. The Game Mastery Guide, you can get the Pocket Book Edition for like £15. That has a whole list. It's a whole array of fully developed NPC. Well, it's NPC gallery, they call it. So it's full of people. You can just scan through and see what one you think would be best for the players and just give them it. So having something like that available is super handy. How you do that is up to you. Even if you just want to have a random selection of names, random selection of personalities, and maybe their wee motivation for that scene, just in a random array of them, like it's a table of 3 columns, just do that. But you can find plenty online that will do it for you. So it's one way to just help encourage, add more to your world, and it makes players feel more immersed and therefore roleplay more in it. So
yeah, I
think that kind of summarises then just some of the recommended things that we would suggest to actually make your games more roleplay heavy. We've spoke about the kind of some of the structures that you might put in place, then some of the things we might say, or some of the tools that you might want to use, like an NPC gallery. But I would like to move into when to move away from heavy roleplay, because there is times for it, and I've certainly seen it. I think we'll just stick with the obvious one, which was an obvious one for me, especially because I do a lot of horror games. Really nasty scenes is something that I wouldn't make players go through. There's no need for it. I think we spoke about the X card, and my kind of opinion on that is, well, I understand it's used. If you feel like you might need to use one, then you're not prepping your players enough, and or there's stuff in there that really shouldn't really be in there. If you're going to do a horrible violence scene, then you should be skimming over it indeed. Anyway, you shouldn't be making players play through that. Maybe that's a player on player basis, but at least all the players I've had, there's a lot of violent games, but it's never been too violent for players, and I won't go over everything. But nasty scenes is definitely one of the examples. I would say as soon as you're going into something horrible, let's say it's a Cthulhu game, people are getting mashed up, you won't make people go through their death in super detail. You're just going to go, and you die, whatever it is, or, it cuts to black and, pull away from the scene. Yeah, that's one of the examples that I think I've got.
Yeah, again, it's like Jordan saying, anything that would potentially make a player feel uncomfortable, then at that point, just go back to mechanical description, get it over and done with, move on to the next thing. That's you done.
Yeah, no need to dwell. And I would say one of the other things as well is, I touched on this earlier, but you might have a table where some people, maybe everyone's big into role-playing, but one thing to kind of start, either to speed up, to cut ahead, or just to move out of a scene for, is where there's some players that maybe you've got a group and you're role playing very heavily because of a very in-depth conversation that you're having with a player. Don't have that conversation to the point where it starts to exclude the other people at the table. Cut ahead. Don't worry about breaking the immersion a wee bit to say, okay, we're going to move to this other scene for a bit. Because I've been in games where I've literally had to sit and bear someone else's conversation. It was worse during COVID, I've got to say, because only one person, well, when you're playing games online, only one person can speak at a time. So, I mean, we've actually even had it with games that you have private conversations away from others and you're put in a wee private room with the GM, which I understand the use for that, but the fact is, if it's something that someone's going to, like, repeat anyway, you're as well just telling everyone in the first instance. But anyway, let's say you have a use for doing that. It's worth doing some role play, but make sure you're getting to the point so you're not excluding people. We've had games where we've been out of a conversation because GM and player have been speaking and we've been sitting for 30 minutes. Do you know what I mean? And I think we're pretty sure we checked in, like, can we come in yet? No. It's like, that is a time, I think, cut to the chase. If you start to lose people, and you can see it at your table, and if you're online it's harder to see, but don't put yourself in a position where you're doing that in the first place, I would say. There's definitely ways to summarise that info.
Yeah, and again, just pretty much exactly like you're saying, if it gets, like, as a DM, right, again, you want everything to be immersive. You don't want to be checking your notes a lot, or you don't want to be pausing a lot and sitting thinking to then come up with an answer. You want everything to have flow, and again, we've talked about that before, and again, it's another point that you'll hear us talking about a lot. So if you are going to ever take anybody into private conversations, whether that's electronic through Roll20 or something else, or whether it's, you're physically there, so you and the other person leave the room, or the other players that are there get up and go do what they're doing, whatever. Have a quick glance at the time, go through whatever it is you're doing, and then have a little glance at the time at some point in when you feel the urge to check it, and don't let that go on too long. I think I can't 100% remember. I think the longest we've ever been outside of a conversation was...
It was probably about 30 so minutes, or was it more?
I think it was more, because I think I then, after being out for a while, decided to check the time, and I wasn't sure when we left, and then however long later I checked, and at that point it was 30 minutes, so I reckon we were a good 45 minutes plus, and it wasn't like at that point it was getting near a time where there was a natural point for taking a break. It was relatively early on for the game.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
And it meant that we were sitting kind of... And the problem with that as well is, and from the players that are outside the game at that point, the players that are there, they will be talking about the game at first, because they're going, oh, I wonder what they're talking about. Oh, I wonder how this is going to affect the game. And you're trying to figure out what's going on. But you can only do that for so long, and then you don't have any new information. You've already came up with your theories, and then you start moving on to regular conversation. So it breaks the immersion for everybody else who's out with that if it goes on too long. If it's short enough, then they're coming up with their theories and things, and they're trying to figure out what they want to do next. That's fine, they're still involved, they're still in the mode of the game. But if it starts to drag on, then they're going to start talking about what the weather's like or whatever. It's gonna spiral.
Yeah, I would basically say in the case of, like, if you're needing to roleplay heavily with someone in a particular character, even if the table's there, it's worth just making sure that you're checking in and cutting away and seeing what these other characters are up to. And if they say, oh, no, nothing now, we're happy to listen. Some people will say, I'm happy to listen to it, that's cool. In the case of secret information, I would say, if it's something that the character is going to tell everyone, just don't cut away in the first place. There's no point. But if it is going to be long, and they might not tell the other players. They just make it clear that they're not getting told and let them learn it. Because one thing I've learned from some of these private chat kind of stuff is you end up kind of not finding out what was said. You don't really care about what it was. It isn't dramatic for you. You're kind of going, all right, it's getting late, you know. Whereas I've had stuff where other players have just something really awesome happened in a recent game. I can't tell you what it is in case we do it, but we're hearing what this one character has to hear. I mean, trust your players. We know that we are hearing stuff we shouldn't know, but we're getting to enjoy everything that's happening. You know, so even though it's not RP for my character, it becomes a movie for us to watch when you've got a good role player and a good GM role playing as well. So anyway, so that's I would say another time when to cut away from doing super RP, whether it be cutting to someone else doing RP or just summarising it using kind of lighter narrative, is when you're actually losing people at the table or taking more than like 5 minutes to describe one thing to someone, you know. I would say that's maybe a time to do that. I think then, speaking actually of the back and forth, a good time to realise when to wrap it up or move away from, like wrap it up, when I say that I mean like summarise the finishing part of the conversation or cutting to the chase, what you want out of this conversation or what you're after. Either doing that or jumping to someone else for RP is when you're finding, if you're a GM speaking to a player, if they're struggling to think of what their character might say, you know, if they're struggling with that aspect of it, don't force them to need to sit there and scratch their head and sweat under the pressure of the spotlight. Let them just say what they're after. You know, they might not have the words, but they might say, well, I've had this in games where I'm trying to hack into something, or I'm trying to persuade someone to let me up to a terminal so I can plug in a USB and hack, you know, whatever it may be. I'm trying to think of that Cyberpunk game. I might not have the personality of my characters, and I might not have the knowledge of the world. Star Trek is a perfect example of this. When I was the captain of the ship, I've never seen a Star Trek episode in my damn life, you know, and it's like I'm now in a position where I need to roleplay this character, and I enjoyed it, but I found the conversation pretty hard to actually sustain. So, and I'm sure the guy that was running the game recognised it. I don't remember ever feeling, oh my god, just this is what I want to do. I do remember that this was something that the guy recognised it and then said, okay, well, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to tell this other commander? And then it would then eventually chalk down to a role. So just being aware of that, I think it's important.
Yeah, and on that note, I think like my memory of what Jordan done is, rather than
I think I said, what the hell? I don't know what I'm doing, guys.
oh yeah, you done that when we were pausing and taking a break. But
that's right.
My memory of what Jordan done is kind of going back to what he said earlier on, that when he's running things, he tries to avoid jargon as much as possible so that everybody can kind of be on a level playing field and enjoy the game. When you were there as the captain of the ship, rather than going down the jargon route because you've got absolutely no clue about what the world is like, he kept everything general. So it was, you know, talking to individual characters and asking them to do something, or relaying that to the GM that he wanted the entire crew to be doing this, that, whatever. So it was all kept in kind of standard English. And then from that point, the GM then picked it up and then took the more specific details or the particular areas of the ship, or, you know, whatever from that point forward. So it meant that you were still engaging with the role play and stuff, but you were doing it in your terms.
Do you know, that's an interesting point, because I'm sure, because stuff that I tend to do, especially with Shire players, I might kind of reiterate what they've decided to do, but I'll then frame it in something that fits, like, so other people that are role playing can kind of keep in that role play space. And I'm sure that that's what the guy was doing. Actually, it's probably something I picked up maybe from him. And it would be like, okay, you're turning the phasers to kill, or whatever it is, I don't know. But, you know, it's like all that sort of stuff where he will basically say, this is what you've done. And I'll be like, that's what I did. But he'll say it in a language that it fits the Star Trek universe. Because I don't know a flaming thing about it, quite frankly. Not that I don't like Star Trek, I just don't tend to do a lot of sci-fi unless it's like horror. Like Aliens, like my sort of sci-fi. Yeah. But anyway, so I think the last thing, and we've touched on this, and this will take us into a good segue, is shy players. the only thing I have to say about this is if you've got a shy player, you can give them kind of the little bits to encouragement. Maybe other players are doing it. Like, you can encourage them to do it. But if they're not engaging with the role play or they're having a really hard time, just give them a break and just pull the brakes off. When I say jargon, generally I mean like game jargon, like mechanical stuff, like actions and bonus actions. That's what I mean by jargon. So maybe you're better using some of these terms for a shy player who's sitting, maybe learning the game for the first time, which I've seen before. They're sitting there and they're like, I don't know what to do. And I'm saying, well, what would you like to do on your turn? For example, you have an action, you can attack, you can interact with something, whatever, and they can go, oh, well, I would quite like to attack. Then it's like, cool. Like, you can use the mechanical talk to get them through it, and once they pick up the system, you'll probably find, or at least I've found, once people know the system well enough, the role play starts to be the focus rather than the mechanics. So just cut the guy a break. Whoever it is that's struggling with the role play and maybe quite shy, don't force them to do it. Just let them move on, and that's it. So that's all I've got to say about moving away from role play when it comes to shy players, I think.
Yeah, and with somebody who is totally new, I would say use a leading question. And if you've got somebody that's a bit more experienced but still maybe a bit shy, then have a neutral question. So a leading question, they're in a tavern and they're supposed to speak to somebody to find out the location of an abandoned mine where kids have disappeared and you have to go and save them, whatever. Then at that person, when you've got them there, then at that point saying, when they're up to the miner and they're trying to talk to them, go, would you like to offer to buy them a drink to break the ice? And then they'll give you whatever response they want to do at that point. Whereas if you've got somebody that's more experienced, giving them the neutral question of, you've went into the tavern, what do you want to do?
Yeah.
So you're still directing them, but you're just, rather than big neon arrow pointing down at the direction that you want them to go or that they should go, that you're just kind of taking that step back and letting them do their own thing. So you're giving them that little bit more freedom, and then gradually you can just remove yourself a little bit more, and let them take the reins and take control and do what they're doing. So for somebody that's new and is shy, leading question. For somebody that's got a bit more experience and is shy, keep it a neutral question so that you're still kind of try and engage them and get them going, but you're not having to kind of railroad them as much.
Yeah, I mean, even if you get experienced players that are struggling with the role playing, you're not sure why that is. It could be they're maybe confused by the area. There's actually still no harm in doing that. It reminds me of a game I done on Monday. It was one of those grindhouse games, and there's a huge map in it for a one shot. I was like, really? This is a lot of info. And it's supposed to be for 4 people, and I played it with 1 because I was like, well, we want to play it and we just want to kill some time, and we really wanted to try one. And it's like the only one I'd read at the time. So I played the 3 other PCs, and my God, it was hard, especially with all the NPCs, like the baddies that was in it. But I played some of the the other PCs, and this guy had done, he picked a character. So it did become at times, especially because as time went on, we started running out of time. It was hard to even just stick into the role play because there was so much info. So actually saying, well, what would you do if you come into this room and there's no lights? You could look to see if there's a light source. You can see that there's some dim lit doorway over there. You could try that and give them, rather than saying, what do you do in this room? And then they go, what can I see? You can just give them some of that info. It's actually a very good way to do it, and I do it all the time. I never even thought about it actually, but I do it all the time.
Yeah, and if you want a heavy RP game and you've got a shy player, scale it back. And again, it might seem obvious, it might not seem obvious, but again, if you've got somebody that's shy, then they're not going to be as comfortable role playing if they do role play, or they're just not going to be doing it at all, and it's going to feel really awkward when everybody else is, and so on and so on. So with your other players that are more confident or more outgoing or whatever, role play with them, find their level, But then with the shy person, scale it right the way back. So again, with that example of finding a miner and try to save, the kids that have fell down and get stuck. And they turn up in the tavern, they start talking to the miner. So you go, right, so you talk to the miner, he gives you one of his maps and he says, just watch out for collapses because the mines have been abandoned for years and they've moved on to a new mine which is further out. And give them as much mechanical detail as you need to give them. Maybe give them slightly more to exaggerate mechanical versus roleplay. And then at the very end, have the miner saying to them, good luck with your journey and I hope you manage to get those kids because, if so-and-so doesn't get back, then that means that the McCormacks have lost all their children, 3 to tuberculosis this year alone. Oh, how terrible. Right, good luck. Right, whatever your, quite dramatic, whatever your situation is, end it with a bit of RP. Because if you end it on it, then you might get the person saying thanks. That one word doesn't matter, but you've got them from going from 0 to something. Then next time when you do it, stick to the same strategy, but just a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. Or in the end of your bit of RP, rather than a goodbye that you're ending with the character, make it a question, get your response, then give it a goodbye. Then that's you get 2 bits of RP from them and gradually build and build and build and build. So scale it back and then build it up.
Yeah, that we've transitioned into like encouraging shy players, which I think is probably the harder thing to do.
Yeah.
A lot of more, even if people don't do role playing games, confident people that are in like the idea of it, or at least when I say shy, maybe I also mean people that would cringe at the idea of it, regardless of where they sit. People reluctant or resistant to doing RP. Others might be into it. They tend to just go in with gusto and just have fun, and they have a blast. The guys I do introduced to D&D whatever a year and a bit ago now that are now obsessed, they've all got handbooks and stuff, and I'm going, I've created monsters. But all of them, or some of them weren't people that would like
What's
RP.
the CR rating?
I know their level, I think they're like 9 or 10, or they're 10. But CR works different in D&D, how the CR works. It's something to do with a mix of spells, but no idea. They can beat CR20 if they try hard enough.
It was just a joke. You've created monsters. What's their CR level?
I wasn't listening. I was on another planet. They're all monsters. But they get into it. Some of them weren't that into role play, but now they all do it, and they're actually a lot of fun. Like, even the thing is, here's the thing about role playing games: you don't actually need to be good at role play to have fun, and that's something that I think it's something just to remember with deeper role playing games or in-depth role playing games. Don't worry if somebody's not that good at it. You shouldn't penalise them for it. Let them having fun. And when it comes to shy players or people reluctant to do it, we've spoke already about some of them, but just to kind of capture them again, just under this topic, leading questions. That's actually a very good one. Leading questions can help. Maybe just describing going into the room. We talked about the feelings and all of that stuff, and maybe finishing it with a couple of prompts. Maybe even if it's not a leading question, some prompts can help. Doesn't need to be like the right prompt all the time, but things to make players start to think. A couple of options, good way to do it. Addressing them by their name's a good one. And we talked about rewarding players earlier, but I think rewarding shy people with the equivalent of inspiration is a really good way to help encourage roleplay, because other players will start to see it too, and even people that are okay with it, but they might be like, oh, I want to try and get some inspiration, and then they'll start to do it. But it's a nice way just to get people moving in, getting used to it, maybe loosening up the joints for roleplay. I just think it's a really good way to do it, because the thing is, for the most part, unless they're reluctant to roleplay because they don't like the idea of it, in which case then you just keep it lighter for them. But if it's purely because of shyness, then you want to just give them little bits of positive reinforcement all the time. Not like you're trying to mould them into a big role player, but you want to just make sure they're having fun with it and just loosening up a bit, because it's a lot of fun. And I think every single person that I've introduced to role playing, even people that maybe have never done it or been interested in it, they've learned how social the actual hobby is, particularly tabletop role playing. I mean, very social, and people just tend to have a blast at it. So
yeah, and again, we've talked about rewarding players, and that's the thing. Like when you say rewarding players, everybody thinks cash money, or they think shiny objects, or whatever. Something as simple
in
as
game cash money. You mean?
Yeah. I mean,
imagine slipping a tenner at a table. That's a nice answer you gave me.
Everybody's turning up to that guy's games, but yeah, if you're lavish enough to give your players real money, or in-game money, or whatever, see something as simple as inspiration. I mean, that potentially could do more for somebody than money, because it's going to give you a mechanical benefit at some point in the game, and that could be enough to save the skin of their character.
Yeah, and you can drop that whenever you want. Pathfinder has hero points, D&D has inspiration, Alien has story points. I don't think we ever used them now that I'm thinking about it. Cthulhu doesn't really have anything like that, I don't think. There's no harm in saying, you can keep a bonus die. You can just do it, even if the game doesn't have a mechanical thing for it.
Yeah, borrow the concept.
Borrow it. Inspiration's a great concept to use. It's a really, really good one. What's it called? Warhammer has wrath points and stuff like that. It's a great way for rewarding players. I would say it's a great way to do it. I would also say then as well, and this is particularly for the shy people or people that are a wee bit nervous about role playing for whatever other reason, assure them that they don't actually need to do the big role play. They might be sitting at the table, you might have a whole bunch, let's say there's a group of 6 of you, right, and so there's 5 players and you're the GM. 4 of them might be like super into roleplay, but there's one person that's kind of twiddling their thumbs and just a bit nervous about the whole thing. You can just assure them that you just talk to them in kind of more gamey speak rather than character speak, and encourage them even before the game. You don't have to do a voice. I've had people say you have to do a voice. We're all from this place, so you've got to do an accent because it's like an England themed game, although it's fantasy. I'm going, no, I just don't want to because I'm not good at voices, so I just don't want to do it, but honestly, I've been at the receiving end of being forced into kind of doing it, and then you kind of get slagged off when I'm not very good at it. So, and we've said don't slag people off, so definitely for shy players, don't slag them off. Yep. They might not even come back to your game, but just make sure that if it's a shyer player, just assure them that it's fine. They can just tell you what they're after, like the intent effectively, as much as I try not to use that in my games. What's your intent? But you could always just say the main thing you need to know as a GM. Let's say I'm talking to a shy player. Let's say Jamie, you're shy. It's like, okay, all I need to know is like what you're trying to do. That's it. Like that's it. What are you doing? And then you can process it and translate it into speak that the role players will enjoy. Yeah. Simple as that. And then you'll find, I'm sure over time, I don't think I've seen anyone that didn't like role playing, like acting out at the table, that didn't do a decent amount of it after several games. I think everybody I know, even if they don't role play super heavily, they still engage with it, and I think that's the most important thing. Yeah,
and again, just like Jordan's saying, again, it's another way of scaling it back, that you just literally break it down to what you want to do, then when they tell you, then you put the little bit of RP on it, and then eventually at some point after seeing you do that however many times, they then might offer a little bit of RP with mainly a mechanical description, and then again it's something that you can build and you can work on from that. But yeah, talking about RP and encouraging shy players and things, I was one of those players. Not so much that I would describe myself as being shy, but like that actual kind of being another character thing and stuff. Even just now, it's not that I'm uncomfortable doing it, or it's not that I struggle to do it. It's just I find it takes me a little bit of time to kind of sink into the kind of the game, the world, whatever. And then after however long of that, then I can kind of find my rhythm a little bit and do it. So even now, I can still struggle a wee bit with it, and I would certainly not class myself as an expert, despite the fact that I'm partial to a voice every now and then.
Yeah, I mean, you do more voices than I do. I mean, I just don't do it. I tend to be okay with getting into character and stuff. but I've also run so many games now that it's just kind of like I'm just used to it. Although it can be hard jumping between characters mid GM, and like the one that I was talking about earlier, the Cthulhu Grindhouse game, I had like had three supposed to be three PCs I was running plus multiple adversaries. You know, I'm going, oh god, what am I supposed to do? But overall, I mean, that's kind of it. Do you know, I was actually going to have a section here for horror stories, but I covered some of the bad ones, like being slagged rotten for not doing an English accent. So I don't have any horror stories, but have you actually? I'm thinking, speaking of like the whole roleplay aspect, have you had any times, probably not really, because I can't think of any for you, that you've maybe had a bad experience, maybe trying to roleplay or anything like that? Is there anything you can share from that side? I've shared a couple of mine, but
I can't think of anything specific, really. I can't think of anything specific. I kind of can vaguely remember a game, and I can't even remember what the game was, can't remember what the character was, or anything about it. That's how vague this memory is. And I decided that I was going to do a voice for the character. But the voice that I was doing at the start wasn't the same as the voice 5 minutes in, which wasn't the same as the voice in the middle. And because of that, it annoyed me and it got in my head, which meant that rather than just kind of making my peace with it and going, the voice is going to be all over the place, but yeah, well, forget about it, who cares? I spent more time trying to fix that than engaging with the game, which meant I was kind of out with the story, which meant I was missing bits, which then meant ultimately I didn't enjoy the game. But that was basically because I was too busy giving myself a row, and it was about me and my ego about it rather than just enjoying it and what was going on. But that really, it wasn't a bad experience, or it wasn't like traumatic or anything. It wasn't anything dramatic to talk about. It was just something so silly that just distracted me, and then it meant that I just lost the rhythm of the game. And again, that's the thing as well. Don't, like with voices and stuff, learn from me. Don't think you need to do that, because if you end up doing what I've done, which is spend more time trying to do a voice than actually playing the game, then you're going to miss most of it, and you're not going to have fun because you're going to be too focused and try to do that.
Yeah, I think that's even times where if you're a GM and you're seeing someone struggle with a voice, like just the way to almost resolve that or try and limit like any self-flagellation you'll be doing as a result of like just having a iffy voice stuff. You know, I've seen it and I'm like, you don't need to do a voice, it might be bad. It's like, I don't care, you're still doing cool, even if it's a crap voice, I don't care. It's cool that they're doing it at the table. In cases like me where it's like, you've got to speak in this accent, I'm like, I don't want to, you know. I did my best and I get slagged for it. Now that's the way that could have been resolved, was just either not enforcing it or just not slagging people for a dodgy accent, you know. So there's plenty of things like that. So general though, it's pretty much common sense. Anything we've spoke about today is, you know, as long as you're not penalising or slagging folk, you know, or making them stick out because they're not doing voices or role playing, then you're pretty much fine. I mean, people will, I think, naturally start to role play the more comfortable they get with the system, but even each other and their character, I would say. So
yeah, general rule of thumb: don't make your players sad.
Yeah, don't make them sad, and speak to them and make sure. And well, if they know that what they're getting into in the first place, then maybe they'll be more used to. They'll be more up for the idea of role play. Like, that goes back to the first point, I suppose. But anyway, I think that just about summarises everything. So I think then it's just really us. I think the only thing left to say is just to mention the socials.
Yeah, so going back to the questions earlier on, so if you want to give us your thoughts on RP and how extreme it's been in your games, or you know, if you've had any bad experiences, just whilst we've been talking about that, I don't think, did we ask about bad experiences at the start? No. Well, if you've had a bad experience, let us know. If you've had good experiences, let us know as well. So you can do that through Facebook, you can do it through Twitter, we've got Discord kicking about there as well, you can do that. There's comments underneath on YouTube. We run questions normally on the podcast on Spotify, if you're there. And I suppose you could leave us a little comment or direct message on Instagram as well if that floats your boat. So that's all the places you can find us. And if you're, well, presumably you're listening to or watching us on your favourite platform, but there's YouTube, there's Spotify, there's Apple Podcasts, there's Google Podcasts, there's all sorts of different things kicking about there. If you go and look, you'll probably find us.
Yep, and I think one thing to add as well is if there's any LARPers in the spot in podcast land or YouTube, I'd actually really be keen to hear from you guys, because I've never done LARPing. I know someone that has, or at least have told us in great extent how much they love it and why they love it. It sounded interesting, but I wonder what a LARPer's opinion of some of this would actually be. I'm kind of interested in that, because I mean, you guys are the top level of immersion when it comes to roleplay.
Probably they're sitting there laughing at us talking. Oh,
that's not roleplay.
Sometimes doing a voice makes me uncomfortable. No, sitting going, pass me my battle axe.
Well, but then maybe they'll come from a place that they knew. They're like, at first of all, I would never do that. Same thing with me role-playing games.
Yeah,
I would never have done them, and then I played Cthulhu, and I'm now running them like multiple times a week. It's weird.
Yeah, but again, that's the thing as well. Like me, I was pretty much, I know we said we were saying bye to everybody, but pretty much the same as well. I didn't think I would get into RPGs and stuff at all. I thought it would be, oh no, I'm going to need to turn up every so often just to kind of appease friends and stuff, so that, oh, no, what am I doing? And yeah, turns out it's great.
Yeah. So with that great note of Jamie finally admitting he likes RPGs, because I think until now you wouldn't. Do you still tell people? Do you tell anyone? Have you ever brought up role-playing games?
No.
I was going to say that. We've almost got him.
I'm kind of thinking the fact that this is now out in the Twitter sphere, that probably it's probably futile.
Have to pay for your sins.
Yeah, something like that. I've still got some street cred somewhere.
Well, on that complete lie, what we're going to do is we're going to finish the episode there. Thanks for people listening on YouTube. Thanks for anyone listening on Spotify or any other audio-based podcast platform. The last thing we're just going to say is we can't wait to hear your guys' responses in whatever form they come in.
Even the LARPers.
Even the LARPers. And from me, it's thanks for listening and watching, and it's bye from me.
Bye from me.